The massive crystal chandelier did not fall until the human sat down. A cold drop of clear fluid leaked from a glass joint directly onto his grease-stained coat sleeve. Cade Mercer did not look up at the ceiling because his eyes were fixed on the silver seating cipher glowing against his palm. The tiny machine buzzed with an angry heat. Then came a sound like tearing sheet metal as the support cables gave way above the banquet table. No warnings, no protocol, no hesitation. Cade threw his weight forward, his heavy work boots skidding across the white marble floor. This empire had thousands of deep secrets. You will want to hear how we broke the biggest one. 3 hours before the ceiling fell, Cade had been standing in the cold docking bay of Aegis Station, scraping baked fuel sludge out of a freighter's secondary cooling manifold. He had only put on the formal jacket because the port supervisor said the invitation came directly from the office of the autarch. The invitation was supposed to be for Alcove 8, a small table near the kitchen where the foreign grease monkeys were meant to sit and watch the crystalline lords eat. But Cade had misread the faded blue numbers on his datapad. He walked straight past the guards and sat down at Alcove 808. The small table sat inside a private balcony that hung over the main ballroom like a birdcage made of solid white quartz. A single person sat opposite him. Sovereignaire Vespera was small, much smaller than the grand statues in the public squares suggested. She sat inside a heavy brass frame that held her upright against the high gravity of the palace spire. A faint, low hum came from the machine, its gyroscopes fighting to keep her shoulders from slumping. Her skin looked like thin parchment, but her eyes were dark and wide. Cade did not bow. Instead, he pulled a scuffed titanium plasma caliper from his pocket and set it down on the silk cloth next to his fork. It was a heavy, ugly tool, scratched from years of gauging the pressure of failing warp coils. The Sovereignaire looked at the tool, then up at Cade's unwashed face. "You are in the wrong seat, human," Vespera said. Her voice was quiet, but it had the sharp edge of someone who had never been forced to speak loudly to get what she wanted. "The numbers on the door said 8, Cade said, wiping his left thumb across his jawline as he counted the distance to the exit. "But if your food is better than what they are serving down by the docks, I might just stay." Vespera did not call the guards. A small, strange smile touched the corner of her lips. For 40 years, the royal doctors had spoken to her only in whispers, treating her like a rare glass vase that might break if someone closed a door too hard. They gave her pills made of ground stardust and wrapped her legs in heated silk. None of it had ever worked. The Kalian bioresonance field operated on a frequency nearly identical to standard human warp coil fluctuations. Yet the great minds of the capital could not understand why her legs remained dead. Then the kinetic luminary shattered. The 3-ton block of quartz did not simply fall. It exploded outward as the emergency dampeners failed. Cade's blue-collar reflexes took over before his brain could process the legal penalties for grabbing royalty. He vaulted the table, his fingers catching the rough edge of her anti-gravity carriage. With a grunt that smelled of stale coffee and machine oil, he drove his shoulder into the heavy brass rigging, shoving the entire structure backward into the stone alcove. The chandelier hit the table a second later. The impact was deafening, sending a spray of razor-sharp white needles across the balcony. One of the shards sliced through the shoulder of Cade's jacket, leaving a thin red line on his skin. Vespera's carriage tipped onto its side, her legs spilling out over the marble floor like loose wires. The ballroom below erupted into a chorus of high-pitched whistles as the guards scrambled toward the stairs. A shadow fell across the alcove entrance before the dust could even settle. Autarch Morven stepped through the smoke, his towering 7-foot frame draped in heavy mantles of woven star iron. The bioluminescent veins along his neck pulsed a deep, angry indigo as he looked at the human kneeling beside his daughter. "Take your hands off her, human," Morven roared, the iron plates on his chest rattling with the vibration of his voice. "You have defiled the air. The penalty for touching the royal blood is extraction." "Your ceiling is rotted, boss," Cade said, not moving an inch. He kept his left hand pressed against the base of Vespera's spine, where a thin blue line of light was flickering erratically. And your daughter isn't paralyzed. Your fancy house is just drowning her out. The autarch raised a massive hand, his fingers curling into a fist that could crack a hull plate. But Vespera reached up, her pale hand catching the edge of her father's iron sleeve. Her fingers were trembling from the shock, but her grip was tight enough to leave a white mark on the metal. "He stays," Vespera whispered. "The doctors have spent 4 decades telling me my body is broken." This man looked at me and asked why the machinery was grounded wrong. The palace labs were cold, smelling of vinegar and clean linen. For 3 months, Cade did not return to the freighter yards. He lived in the lower basement of the spire, surrounded by millions of credits worth of Kalian medical computers that he mostly ignored. The royal engineers watched from the balcony above, their crystalline faces twisted in disgust as the human used a common soldering iron to attach human warp coil wires to the delicate silver nerves of a royal medical harness. Vespera sat on a high metal bench, her bare feet hanging above the floor. She had grown used to the smell of Cade's tobacco and the constant, rhythmic tapping of his titanium plasma caliper against the lab tables. "They think you are going to kill me," Vespera said one evening, watching him adjust a small copper screw near her knee. "I chart engine tolerances, Your Highness," Cade muttered, not looking up. "Royal protocol is outside my pay grade. Your nerves are fine. The problem is your empire's biofield. It is too strong. Every time your brain tries to send a signal to your toes, the house shielding thinks it's an outside attack and smothers it." "A defensive reflex," she said, her fingers tracing the scuffed metal of his caliper. "They spent decades treating me like a fragile artifact." "You looked at me and saw a puzzle worth solving." "Everything is just a machine with a missing part," Cade said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, square block of gray alloy. It was a neuroconductive resonance lattice, a dirty piece of human scrap he had salvaged from a broken freighter engine. Some empires demand a blood sacrifice for change. This one just needed a salvaged neuro-wire. The work was brutal and slow. Twice, the resonance field spiked, the sudden surge of energy turning the silver wires white-hot. Vespera gasped, her head falling back against the headrest as her heart rate monitor shrieked in the quiet room. Cade did not freeze. He grabbed the live wire with his bare thumb and forefinger, grounding the current through his own arm until his skin blistered and smelled of burnt meat. He didn't complain. He just spit on the floor, wiped his left thumb across his jawline and started over. By the end of the 3rd month, the autarch had run out of patience. Morven entered the lab without warning, his indigo veins thumping with a dark, heavy rhythm under his throat. 6 guards stood behind him, their long plasma pikes hummed with lethal force. "The solar cycle is ending," Morven said, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. "The High Council demands a pure heir, not a human toy. If she does not stand by sunrise, you will be thrown into the deep fold without a suit." Cade did not look at the guards. He stepped toward Vespera, his burnt fingers steady as he lifted the heavy titanium plasma caliper one last time. He held it against the microservo on her left ankle, measuring the exact neurotension required to let a sovereign walk. The distance was exactly 3 millimeters. He tightened the screw. Right before he flipped the live switch on the final lattice, Cade stopped, pulled a rag from his pocket, and meticulously wiped a smear of black grease off his knuckles. The silence in the room was absolute. "Are you ready?" Cade asked quietly. Vespera looked at her father, then down at her feet. "Turn it on." The armor whined, the lattice glowed, the sovereign stepped. The sound was not loud. It was just the soft, rhythmic hiss of hydraulic fluid passing through synthetic joints as her heel touched the cold stone floor. She did not stumble. She did not lean on the brass frame. Vespera walked forward 3 paces, her movements stiff but entirely her own, until she was standing directly in front of her father. The autarch looked down at her, his massive shoulders dropping as the indigo fury in his neck faded into a calm, pale blue. "It is done," Morven said, his voice losing its thunder. He looked at the grease-stained human, then back at his daughter's legs. "The contract is satisfied." Within 100 characters of her first step, a faint, rhythmic tracking signal hummed from the base of her old, abandoned carriage, but nobody in the room was listening to the old machine anymore. Cade turned toward the exit, dropping his caliper back into his pocket with a dry click. 20 years later, the Aegis Station Core did not look like an imperial outpost anymore. The high, white quartz walls were still there, but the ground was covered in wide paths of gray human steel. The light from the artificial sun was warm, filtering down through the iron support beams where thousands of small, blue-tinted mobility rigs glided through the crowds. The rigid lines of rank had blurred, replaced by the steady, practical clatter of a working station. 2 children, their small coats smudged with black grease, sprinted across the metal deck toward the garden entrance. Vespera watched them from the edge of the terrace, her legs moving with the smooth, silent precision of a well-maintained engine. Cade stood beside her, his hair graying at the temples, his left thumb still tracing the line of his jaw out of old habit. He reached into his coat and pulled out the old titanium plasma caliper, its scuffed surface reflecting the blue glow of the city below. The horizon wasn't a painting anymore. It was just another place to walk together.